imagine crossing a vast, terrifying ocean. You expect to just scoop gold right off the ground. You expect to get rich and go home.
Right.
But instead, a year later, you're trapped in a swamp. You are trading your very last copper kettle to local tribes for just, like, a handful of corn, purely to survive the winter.
Yeah, it's grim.
It is. Welcome to our deep dive today. We're looking at Jamestown, Virginia in the year 1607. And before we get into it, I want to set some ground rules for you listening.
That's a good idea. We really need to frame this right.
Exactly. So our mission today is to take this slow. We're going to use simple, clear language, and we're going to speak deliberately. We really want you to be able to easily follow along and deeply absorb this history, because we are not just memorizing dates today.
No, definitely not. Dates are, well, they're the least interesting part of this.
Right. We want to understand how America actually developed. And our core theme, drawn straight from our source material today, is this: America did not begin in comfort.
I love that phrase. It really is a shocking contrast to the story we usually hear.
It really is.
Because when we think of early America, we tend to picture this very comfortable myth. You know, brave families arriving, stepping off a boat onto fresh land, and just peacefully building a new world.
Like the classic Pilgrim story, right?
Exactly, like the Pilgrims, which happened later.
Yeah.
But that myth, it feels like a beautiful, safe painting. But the reality of Jamestown, our very first permanent English settlement, is a much harder story.
It proves that early colonization was not some heroic holiday.
No, it was deeply painful. It was incredibly risky and honestly morally complicated. It developed through intense conflict, terrible mistakes, and massive social change.
So it's a story of human survival, but also driven by deep greed and powerful ambition and serious moral compromises.
Right. So to really understand why this settlement was so incredibly difficult, we have to look at the real reason these people crossed the ocean in the first place.
Yeah, let's start there.
Yeah.
Because if they weren't families looking for religious freedom, like those pilgrims we mentioned, what were they?
Well, they were part of a business project.
A business project.
Yeah. Jamestown was founded in 1607, and it was supported by an organization called the Virginia Company.
Okay.
And we need to be really clear here. The Virginia Company was not a religious charity.
Right.
It was a corporation. It was designed from day one to generate profit. It was a business model.
A business model in 1607. That completely shifts how we view the people on those ships.
It really does.
Because if it's a business project, it has to have a business plan, right?
Yeah.
How did a colonial business model actually work back then?
Well, it was driven by competition and investment. At a national level, England wanted to compete with other European powers.
Specifically Spain, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Spain had already traveled to the Americas and had extracted massive, just unbelievable wealth. They were pulling ships full of gold and silver back to Europe.
And England wants a piece of that action.
Naturally, the English crown wanted that same power and global influence. But here's the catch. The king does not want to pay for the entire trip himself.
Too risky.
Way too risky. So the king essentially outsourced the risk. He gave a charter, which is basically a royal permission slip, to the Virginia Company.
Okay, so the company gets the permission slip. Then what?
Then the company raised money from private investors in London. These investors bought shares in the company.
Just like buying stock today.
Exactly like that. And these investors expected the company to send ships across the ocean, set up a camp, find valuable resources, mostly gold, and send that wealth back.
They wanted a return on their investment.
A major return. They expected results.
But what about the settlers themselves? The people physically getting on the boats?
They were essentially the employees and contractors of this business. Many of them were gentlemen or soldiers who went with the expectation of finding quick wealth.
They just wanted to get rich quick.
Yeah, they wanted to pick up gold, get rich, and return to a comfortable life in England. But the investors back in England expected these results without really having any idea how hard life in Virginia would be.
Right, and I want to just pause here and use an analogy, because the source material makes this gap between the dream and the reality so clear.
Go for it.
Imagine a modern business startup. You have a group of tech founders sitting in a very comfortable office in a big city.
Okay, I can picture that.
And they write this perfect business plan that says, we will build this app, we will launch it in a new country, and we will make millions. And the investors read the plan and they love it, so they hand over the cash.
Right.
But when the actual workers arrive in that new country, they realize the computers don't work, there's no internet, and the local market is completely different from what they researched.
Yeah, the reality on the ground completely destroys the plan on paper.
Exactly. So my question is, if the Virginia Company was run by these elite London merchants who supposedly knew how to manage global trade, how could they be so utterly unprepared?
Well,
Were they just arrogant, or was their information just totally wrong?
it was honestly a dangerous combination of both.
Hmm.
Arrogance and bad information played a huge role. They assumed North America would be exactly like the parts of Central and South America that Spain had already conquered.
They just generalized the whole continent.
Yeah, they assumed there would just be gold lying around and local populations that they could easily control. They had high ambition, but incredibly low preparation.
And ambition without preparation can be dangerous.
Very dangerous. Because the settlers went looking for gold, they were completely unprepared for the actual hard work of survival. They didn't bring the right tools, and they certainly didn't bring the right skills.
Right, because they were looking for gold, which, spoiler alert, they didn't find.
No gold.
So what did they find instead?
They found a harsh, unfamiliar environment. And to survive, they needed to do intense physical labor. They needed to clear land, plant crops, and build strong shelters.
But you mentioned earlier that a lot of these guys were gentlemen.
Exactly. Many of these settlers were wealthy gentlemen who had literally never done a day of physical labor in their lives. They did not know how to farm.
That is just a recipe for disaster.
It is. And to make matters worse, they chose a terrible location for their headquarters.
Yeah, the sources describe Jamestown Island as basically a swamp.
It was a swamp. Now, they picked it because it was easy to defend from Spanish ships. It was tucked away up a river.
Defensively, that makes sense.
Defensively, yes, that was its only benefit. But environmentally, it was an absolute disaster. The water was brackish.
Let's slow down and explain that word, brackish.
Brackish means it was a mix of salt water and fresh water.
Hmm.
And drinking that is incredibly dangerous for the human body.
Wow.
Plus, the swampy environment was a massive breeding ground for mosquitoes, which meant disease spread rapidly.
Okay, let me push back a little here.
Sure.
If the plan is clearly failing, there's no gold, the location has terrible water, everyone is getting sick from mosquitoes, why didn't they just change the plan?
What do you mean?
Like, if I start a business and I realize the building has no water and my employees are getting sick, I break the lease and I move to a new building. Why stay in the swamp?
Because they were trapped. Moving an entire settlement of sick, starving people through completely unfamiliar wilderness is incredibly difficult.
I guess that's true.
And remember the business model. The investors in England were still sending orders demanding a profit. So the settlers were caught. They were stuck between the impossible demands of their bosses in London and the brutal, deadly reality of the Virginia swamps.
That makes sense. The desire for money pushed them into a trap. And reality, as they say, doesn't care about your business plan.
It really doesn't.
Reality demands food, water, and shelter.
And because they spent their crucial summer months searching for gold instead of planting crops, they walked directly into a winter that would nearly wipe them completely off the map.
Right. And this brings us to a period of history that is, frankly, really hard to even think about. The sources call it the starving time.
Yes, the starving time.
Conditions went from bad to apocalyptic. Let's really take a moment to have you, the listener, imagine this. Imagine the pure fear of the starving time.
It's a terrifying concept.
It is, because survival is never automatic. It requires basic human needs: food, water, shelter, work. And they had none of it.
The starving time was a period of severe food shortages. The settlement almost totally failed. Supplies from England were incredibly unreliable.
You just couldn't count on a delivery.
No, a ship might arrive or it might sink in a storm. You just didn't know. So people died of starvation, of disease, and just exposure to the freezing cold.
The settlement just became a place of total fear and desperation.
Which brings up a really important concept we need to explore slowly here. The concept of leadership in a crisis.
Right, because when people are divided and frightened and still clinging to these unrealistic expectations of finding gold, the danger just increases.
Exactly. When things fall apart, you need leadership.
Yeah.
And we need to look at the vocabulary of survival here. Planning, discipline, responsibility, decision-making.
But leadership isn't just about who has the power to give orders, right?
No, not at all.
Based on the source, leadership in a situation like this is really about responsibility. How do you separate those two? Authority versus responsibility.
That's a great question. Authority is just having the right to tell people what to do. The early leaders in Jamestown had authority from the company, but they kept trying to execute a failed business model.
They kept looking for gold when people were starving.
Right. Responsibility, on the other hand, means looking at a grim reality and adapting to it. A responsible leader has to look at the starving camp and say, the gold does not exist. The business plan is dead.
We need to plant food or we die.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It requires intense discipline. Someone has to ration the tiny bit of food that is left. Someone has to force sick, exhausted people to work for the common good.
It's about making incredibly difficult choices just to keep a fraction of the community alive.
And poor leadership in a crisis like that makes the suffering so much worse because people waste their remaining energy arguing instead of surviving.
And the harsh truth of the starving time was that no amount of internal leadership could save them entirely.
No.
The English settlers simply could not survive on their own. They were completely incapable of living in this new environment without outside help.
They had to look beyond their swamp.
Right. They had to interact with the people who already lived on this land.
And this is a crucial point. The English did not arrive in an empty territory.
Let me repeat that. They did not arrive in empty territory.
They entered a region that was already controlled by a powerful established society, the Powhatan Confederacy.
The Powhatan Confederacy. So the native peoples already had their own systems in place.
Very much so. They had complex systems of diplomacy, they had extensive trade networks, they had functioning economies, and strong political leaders. They weren't just small, scattered groups.
So I want to look at the mechanics of this interaction. How did they actually interact at first?
Initially, relations involved trade and negotiation.
Because the English desperately needed food to survive.
Yes, specifically corn, which the native peoples grew in abundance. And the English also really needed local knowledge.
Like how to hunt or navigate the rivers.
Exactly, how to survive the winter. And in exchange, the English offered items like copper, glass beads, and iron tools.
Okay, let's view this from the native point of view for a second.
Sure.
If you are the leadership of the Powhatan Confederacy, you see these English settlers arrive. They are sick, they are starving, they are terrible at farming. Why not just let them starve? Why trade with them at all?
Because native politics were just as complex as European politics. The Powhatan leadership likely saw the English as a potential resource.
A resource? How?
Well, the English had metal weapons and tools. By trading with them, the Powhatan could gain valuable goods that increased their own power and prestige in the region. It might give them an advantage over rival native groups.
Oh, I see.
So at first, the English just looked like a small, weak group that could be easily managed or maybe even absorbed into the larger native alliance.
But the native leaders quickly understood that this was not just a small, innocent village.
Right. For the Powhatan Confederacy, the English represented a growing colonial presence. And a colonial presence means a permanent, expanding footprint.
They were backed by an empire.
Yes. And as more ships arrived, bringing more settlers who needed more food and more space, the dynamic shifted. The English were threatening their land and power.
This is a really important pivot. Why couldn't they just maintain that initial trade relationship? I mean, they traded food for metal. It worked. Why did it have to turn into severe conflict?
Well, the source explains a larger pattern in history here. Colonization is not just about settling in a new place. It is fundamentally a transformation of power over land.
Let's unpack that slowly. A transformation of power over land.
The English business model required growth. To pay back those investors in London, the colony had to expand.
Right. More settlers meant they needed more space to live.
And more fields to farm. The math of land use is unforgiving. If one group needs to constantly expand their borders to survive, and another group already lives on that land, conflict is inevitable.
More land pressure led directly to native displacement.
Exactly. As the English demanded more land and resources, and when they couldn't negotiate for it, they took it by force. The relationship shifted from trade to severe violent conflict.
And that demand for land was about to absolutely explode.
Yes, it was.
Because after all that suffering, after the starving time, after failing to find gold, the settlers finally found a way to make their business project wildly profitable.
They found a product that Europe actually wanted.
Tobacco.
Tobacco. It became the crop that saved Jamestown economically.
It's kind of staggering to think that one single product, a plant, completely shaped an entire society. How did tobacco change the game?
Well, tobacco was highly popular and very profitable in Europe. People were willing to pay high prices for it. So for the Virginia Company, tobacco was the answer to their prayers. It generated serious money.
But the source material uses a phrase here that we need to slowly dissect. The phrase is, success came at a cost.
Yes, success came at a cost. We need to look closely at the mechanics of tobacco farming.
Okay, let's do that.
Tobacco is not an easy crop. It requires immense amounts of land because it quickly depletes the nutrients in the soil.
So you plant it for a few years, the soil dies, and you have to move.
Exactly, you have to clear a brand new field. So if the entire economy of Jamestown depends on tobacco, they have this endless, ravenous hunger for fresh land.
Which accelerates the conflict with native peoples that we just discussed.
Right. The more tobacco they planted, the more native land they encroached upon. The financial success of the colony was directly tied to the displacement of the Powhatan people. That is the first major cost.
But there is a second requirement for tobacco farming, right? And
Got it.
this one shaped the moral character of the entire nation.
Yes, labor. Tobacco farming requires extremely hard, intense physical work. Clearing forests, planting, weeding, harvesting, curing the leaves, it's exhausting work.
And a handful of surviving settlers couldn't possibly do all this work themselves. Not if they wanted to get rich.
No, they needed a massive workforce. And this led to the creation of the plantation economy.
Let's define that for the listener. What is a plantation economy?
A plantation is a large farm designed to mass produce a single crop for market profit. But a plantation only works if you can control the workers and keep labor costs as low as possible.
Which brings us to a really deep moral lesson from the sources. Economic history is important because money is not separate from morality.
That is so true.
The way society creates its wealth shapes its laws and its values.
Absolutely. The economic demand for labor drove the colony to build a system of human exploitation.
Yeah.
They needed workers, so they relied on forced labor. Tobacco saved the colony, but it built a system rooted in exploitation.
And this system of wealth and exploitation laid the foundation for the complex society that would follow. It leads us directly to what the sources call the dual legacy of Jamestown.
The dual legacy. This is perhaps the most important concept we'll explore today.
A legacy of promise and a legacy of tragedy, happening in the exact same place.
Let's examine this duality slowly. Over time, because of the wealth from tobacco, Jamestown grew. It went from a small, struggling settlement into a larger society. English law and culture took root.
And out of this growth came a remarkable political promise.
Yes, the promise. In 1619, Jamestown established the House of Burgesses.
The House of Burgesses, what was that exactly?
It was an early example of an elected representative assembly. The Virginia Company realized that managing a growing colony from London was impossible.
Right. Communication took months back then.
Exactly. The colony needed local laws. So they allowed property-owning men in the colony to vote for representatives. And these representatives gathered to pass local laws.
It started the American tradition of self-government, the idea that citizens should have a voice in the rules that govern them.
It's a beautiful ideal, but we must immediately confront the tragedy that grew right alongside it.
The tragedy. Because to work those massive tobacco fields, the colony relied on forced labor.
Yes. Initially, they relied on indentured servants.
Let's explain indentured servitude slowly because it's a specific legal term.
Indentured servants were often poor people from England. They wanted opportunity, but they had no money to pay for the ship across the ocean. So they signed a contract.
They worked for a set time in exchange for passage.
Right. They agreed to work for a planter in Virginia for, say, 4 to 7 years. In exchange, they got their boat ticket, food, and shelter.
But it was a brutal life, wasn't it?
Incredibly brutal. Many indentured servants died from disease or exhaustion long before their contracts ended.
But over time, the supply of volunteers from England couldn't keep up with the demand for tobacco labor. Planters wanted more workers, and they wanted permanent control.
And this is where the profound tragedy evolves. Africans were brought into the colony. At first, their legal status was somewhat fluid, but the planters who controlled the wealth also controlled the laws.
Because they sat in that newly created House of Burgesses.
Exactly. The people making the laws were the exact same people who needed the labor. Over time, this evolved into a permanent racial system of slavery.
I marvel at this incredible contradiction. I really do. How can political promise and moral tragedy happen in the exact same place?
Let's speak very carefully here, because it is a paradox. Freedom and inequality grew side by side. Opportunity and exploitation existed together.
They are completely intertwined.
Yes, and to understand America honestly, a mature learner must hold both of these truths at the same time. You can't just pick one.
Right. And let me ask you, the listener, a direct question. When we look at history, do we usually want it to be simple? Do we just want good people on one side and bad people on the other?
Most beginners really do want simple history. It's easier to digest. But real history is made by flawed human beings.
Yeah.
A settlement can invent beautiful political ideals, like self-government, while simultaneously leaving many, many people completely outside of those ideals.
Building a system of permanent slavery to fund their freedom.
Exactly. Understanding this difficult balance is the key to understanding the entire American story.
It really is. So as we wrap up our deep dive today, let's slowly recap the 3 levels of history we've discussed from our source material.
Good idea.
So the first level is just the basic story. Jamestown, 1607, a business venture that struggled but became the first permanent English settlement in America.
Then there's the second level, which is the human story. The pure terror of the starving time, the frantic, blind hope for wealth, the immense suffering of forced labor, and the brutal clash with the Powhatan Confederacy.
And finally, the third level, the deeper meaning. How these early choices shaped the future of America, how the demand for land and labor built systems of both representative government and severe exploitation.
And that deeper meaning is exactly why this is so relevant to you listening right now. America is a country built on stories.
Stories of freedom, faith, invention.
Right. But also stories of exclusion and profound contradiction. By learning about Jamestown, you are learning how to discuss real life. Well, it helps you understand modern debates. When we argue today about power or rights or who owns the land or identity, all of those debates have roots in the dual legacy we just talked about.
That makes a lot of sense. And I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to just mull over on your own.
What's that?
We talked a lot today about the phrase, success came at a cost.
You did?
In Jamestown, the incredible financial success of tobacco cost the displacement of native peoples, and it cost the freedom of enslaved workers.
The cost was massive.
So, as you look at the modern world, whether it's a booming new technology, a successful global business, or a rapidly growing city, I want you to ask yourself, when something succeeds today, who or what is paying the unseen cost?